This is House Planning Help episode 42. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're into green building. I'm exploring what houses we should be constructing in the 21st century. Alongside this, I have a personal goal, and that's to create an energy efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this session, my guest is Fran Bradshaw from Thorne Architects, and she shares her story of building a straw bale passive house. But just before we get to that, I wanted to talk about flooding. Every so often I like to throw in what I see as a significant story. It's normally something that I spotted. I mentioned when I was out in Las Vegas, I got the chance to see Lake Mead firsthand and how the water level had dropped in that, and a really frightening situation. But recently I saw a news story on CBS that sums up that really well. If you are in that area, I'm sure you know about all of these issues, but we have the reverse situation here in the UK. It's crazy. Lots of floods, and not just rain, because I can tell you as a resident of the UK, you get used to rain here, but this is significant rainfall. Last month, Britain saw the most rainfall since 1760. And Somerset, an area of the UK, was worst affected. But that doesn't mean it's the only place. For example, in the town where I live, which I would say we never have any issues, and speaking to a lot of people who've lived in this town for years and years, they've never seen it like this before. And what would normally be a field is completely flooded, and I walked past one pub that was underwater and cars were stuck in the floods. And so it is having an impact. And it could just be a freak event, who knows, or it could be something connected with climate change, and I certainly have my questions about that. But whether or not you think it's anything to do with that, it must change our perception. This is what I've started thinking, because we've always wanted to live down in the West Country area of the UK. It could be a good place to go and retire. But now we're thinking, no way, not going there. That seems to be the first hit when anything like this happens. Perhaps another area will be better, or certainly thinking about where you build a house or where you live, because you don't want to be anywhere in a water risk area. Or if you have to live in these areas, because sometimes I see articles about new constructions taking place in the floodplain, and you think that's a little bit weird. You're asking for trouble in that situation. So maybe we have to think about what we're constructing and make the houses able to float in these rare times, which might not be so rare anymore, when we get all this heavy rainfall and the area floods. So I thought that was really interesting. I just wanted to include those thoughts in the podcast before we get to our main content. But I'd love to hear from you. Do you like hearing these little bits as well that I throw in? Because it's almost like we're on this timeline, isn't it? And we just seem to be having these significant stories. So let's get to our main content for today. Fran Bradshaw is from Thorne Architects, a practice that's always had a focus on sustainability and community-based work. Fran was a builder before she became an architect, and she's very much interested in the practical side of things as well. So for this interview, we're going to focus on a straw bale house that she's building for herself. It aims to meet the passive house standard, and before we got onto that project, I was just asking her about whether she'd done anything like this in London, because Thorne Architects are based in the middle of London, so I wondered whether she'd had any cause to use straw in the past.
Yeah, we did our first straw bale project in London, which is a small sort of visitors centre in the park in Tottenham. And that was really what made me want to use the same sort of technology for my own house, because I thought it was really wonderful.
So tell us a little bit more about that.
So what was really great about that was that it was part of the original plan from the Friends group about how they would get the whole project going, was to do something which people could really be involved in the building work on site. So they were going to be involved in the design of the building, but also that they could be involved in building it. So from the very beginning, when we did the sort of Heritage Lottery funding application, we had an idea that it would be a straw bale building. So we were designing it with that in mind. And that carried through, and it was done in straw, and it was built by local people. And it was really exciting being on site and just seeing how enthusiastic people were, and what a great kind of community benefit it was.
What element of that did you want to bring to your own build?
Two things. One, I really liked it that my friends and family would join in and help build this new house, which is such an exciting thing to do. But what I really noticed on the completion of the building in Haringey was the quality of the environment and the way that people commented and noticed what it felt like to be in the building. And I think a lot of that was to do with the feeling of buildings that are built of natural materials that affect lots of different sort of sensory things like the acoustics, the humidity and colours, what you see. So the whole thing comes together to give you a sort of a very different feeling of being in that building. And it's a very lovely feeling. And lots of people talked about the building being quite beautiful. I thought that was very interesting because it's not a kind of obviously beautiful building from the out. You would not say, oh, what a beautiful building in like Georgian house, pretty, kind of way at all. It's something about the quality that you feel when you're actually in it.
Have there actually been any straw bale passive houses in the world yet? Or is this break? They have?
Yes, not in this country, but there are some people working on the continent who've done some really interesting work.
What are the challenges then to get to passive house with a straw bale construction?
Well, it's more in the detailing. I mean, there is some sort of scepticism about the thermal performance of straw, but I think that has been fairly well evidenced over a number of projects, and there's some work that's been done in Germany around that. But the detail of how you turn this sort of rather chaotic piece of building material into something which is actually very precise, because to achieve passive house, you need to make sure that all your details and all the joints are all very neat and carefully airtight. So I think that's really the main challenge. We work with Straw Works, who are the people who've been doing straw bale building in this country for a long time and who are got loads of experience of working with people who haven't done it. I mean, that is what's so great about straw, that it's not that it isn't a skillful thing. It is a skillful thing. You do need to know quite a lot to do it well, but you don't need everybody to be experienced. So whereas to achieve a beautiful brick wall, everyone who is actually building needs to really have experience building it. To build a good straw bale building, you need straw works. You need one or two people who really, really know what they're doing. But the rest are just people who, need to be interested and want to do a good job and maybe with a bit of practical experience.
Is it plentiful as a material?
Yeah. It's a waste material, effectively. I mean, the straw bales that we're using for building are the ones that are baled mostly for horses, animals. So they're the biggest bales that you can manually, move around. And those balers that produce that size are still used because people need them. People who've got animals, horses or whatever, do need them. So they're still part of the agricultural scenery.
Thinking about the build and the design that you've gone for, was this just something that was always in your mind, your dream home? Perhaps you could tell us a bit about the plot and how you got everything together.
Yes, I was really lucky to build a house for myself 20 years ago in London. And at that time, we were working on timber frame buildings and looking at what we called then breathing wall construction, which I still think is a very nice, simple, effective way of building. And I suppose building for yourself just gives you the possibility of exploring something where you're taking all the risk. You don't need to find somebody who's prepared to experiment for you. You can do it yourself. And that makes it really good fun. I'm a terrible believer in what I believe in, so I feel very confident that this will work. It doesn't feel such a big risk as it might do to someone who hasn't got any experience of it. So given that we were working with straw bale building and it's so interesting, and I could see that there are things we'd done at the Environment Centre that we could do better this time round. It was the obvious thing to do. And then the site is this village site, and it's right by the Norfolk Broads, which has got a tradition of reed thatch as a roofing material. And I found that the thatch was being cut about a mile away from the site. So it was just too tempting,
While we're on that subject, because it does interest me a lot, I have my wife always saying that she'd like a thatch, and then I think, how practical is this? So maybe I can ask you now, what is the situation? Was this difficult to incorporate in, or just fine?
No, it's absolutely no problem. There's loads. There are good thatchers. There's a a good thatching industry. It's small. It's mostly rethatching existing buildings. I was used to sort of having been in a thatched house, so I knew the things that people are worried about. Yeah, it's just a very good roofing material. It's very durable. It's got a natural insulation value. So there was no reason not to use it. I mean, it's more expensive going with thatch rather than clay tiles or something. And that was my kind of extravagance, really, that I was lucky to be able to do it.
Could you not go down there and cut it yourself?
No, the reed cutting is a pretty skillful business, but the people who reed cut, they cut their patch. So they have long contracts. That's their patch. And the reed quality is partly to do with how well and methodically it's cut, because what you're looking for is, reeds that are all the same strength, same length and same diameter. And that's a result of the sort of bed being well cut each year. And then actual thatching is really a skillful. It's really great to watch because there's a very lovely rhythm to it. And the way they turn these kind of bundles of plants into this immaculate kind of roof is just wonderful.
How does it work when you're trying to create an air barrier? Well, presumably that's not the actual layer, airtightness layer.
We've laid the thatch on a fire board, and that board is moisture permeable but airtight, and it's taped at the joints. So that's the airtight layer just underneath the thatch. And then the thatch is then not airtight, but it's still quite compact and it does have an insulation value.
When we're looking at this house, you've clearly gone out of your way to try and incorporate natural materials, but are there any points that you have to resort to something? For example, what have you done in the foundations?
Yeah, because we were going for Passivhaus, the connection between the walls and the floor, is always a tricky one. And I decided to go with the reinforced concrete slab there, which is quite economical on concrete, but still, obviously, you are using concrete. And the wood, you could have done it differently. But I wanted to work with a local contractor as well as bring in some quite specialist people, like, for the straw bale and for the timber frame and so on. And I just thought I wanted to start with something that they felt really confident about. So, yeah, there was a kind of level of compromise there.
The timber frame, I know that because I came there on a day when you were actually doing quite an unusual test. I don't think I realised that when I arrived, but I certainly did once I'd completed the video and put it all together. So I apologise if I've misinterpreted what was going on that day on that video. But it does give a good visual representation of the house. And I know that the air tightness layer is on the outside.
Yeah.
So maybe you could explain what it is, because we're talking about natural materials.
Yeah, I mean, normally you would do the air tightness layer on the inside because you don't want warm, moist air to go from the room into the wall fabric. But in this case, because there's a timber frame inside and the straw is outside the timber frame, it would have been very difficult to make the airtight barrier work well inside because you've got all these timber penetrations and quite big bits of timber, so there are shakes and so on in the timber. So it would have been really hard to achieve the airtightness. We went with Paul Jennings, who is our airtightness expert advisor. We decided to go for using the outside layer of render as the airtight layer. So the concrete slab is the airtight layer in the ground, and then you're connecting that to the render on the outside of the straw walls, and then you're connecting that to the fireboard on the roof. There are certain theoretical risks with doing that because inside you've got clay plaster and that effectively is airtight as well. But for instance, at the windows where it's all taped, it's on the outside. So theoretically you could get moist air going at the junction between the internal plaster and the window and sort of condensing kind of within the straw. That is a theoretical kind of risk. But in practice, because all the materials are moisture permeable and hygroscopic as well, the likelihood of that, and also because you've got MVHR ventilation at the coldest times working, so the likelihood of it being an actual problem, I think is, well, we feel pretty confident that it won't be a problem. But it's been very interesting discussing it all, and what we agreed with, particularly with Peter Warm, who are the certifiers for Passivhaus, was that we would install moisture monitors so we can actually see how the straw's performing. And in fact, there's so little research going on about these natural materials that I'm very pleased that we'll be able to contribute something towards, a better understanding of how these materials do perform. And obviously, if there is a problem, then there are ways that we can rectify it. But given that whole design kind of route, I think it was quite a sensible way to solve that air tightness problems.
Let me see if I understand this. So you will have moisture that will be coming through the building. It is breathable, and that's how you've designed it.
Yes, all the materials, apart from the concrete slab, are moisture permeable.
Will you notice that at all inside the house?
No, I don't think you... Well, the way you notice it is something different. What clay, the internal plaster is clay, and what clay and straw and those kind of materials do is that they absorb moisture. So if you've got a particularly humid day, some of the moisture is actually absorbed into the clay, and then if the next day it's windy and it dries out, it then breathes it out again. A bit like those kind of sports clothing, kind of that whole idea of wicking away. So what that means is that you get a sort of modified humidity within it's a much more stable, and it's more stable in terms of thermally as well. So it gives you, the internal air quality is much more even. And so that's the way in which you observe this whole quality of moisture permeability. And I mean, in our practice, we're doing quite a lot of work with existing buildings as well as new buildings. In new buildings, you've really got a choice. You can go for a sort of moisture permeable approach to building, or you can go for keeping all the moisture out, the moisture sealed kind of approach. But when you're working with existing buildings, you really don't have that choice. There are very few existing buildings where you have the possibility of really keeping moisture out.
This might be a good time to bring in a question that we had about this, and it's from Daniel Maskell in Bath, who wanted to know, how are you dealing with the effects of cracking due to shrinkage, movement, and what will that effect have on the airtightness?
Yeah, you've got to maintain both lime plaster and clay plaster. There will be cracking, and we'll repair the cracks.
How often do you foresee that happening?
Well, I imagine that there'll be, as you would normally have at the end of a kind of drying out period, so maybe next summer, there'll be cracks to deal with. And then after that, I don't know. I mean, lime render is much more flexible than the cement-based renders. Maybe that there isn't very much cracking, but I think you have to accept that might, that could be something that you have to deal with.
How many air tests have you had now?
Well, just 2. I mean, really, the one that we did with you was not really an air test, so we were looking for figures. It was more an exploration of how straw performs, which was set up by Barbara from Strawworks. The first air test we did a few weeks after that was when the airtight barrier was complete, and we got a figure of sort of just under 1 air changer now.
At that point, then, are there areas that you can see are weak? Because when I was there, I witnessed going around and seeing where the leaks were. Obviously, we knew that it was a long way from finish, but did you do the same thing?
Yes, we did identify a few small places, and we fixed them and then retested, and it made a very slight difference. And then after that, what Paul thinks is that it's disaggregated kind of around the whole building. So when we've completed all the plaster on the inside and we put insulation in the roof and tacked it, and then that'll be the time to kind of retest again and to see if that's made a difference.
What insulation have you got in the roof?
We're going to be putting warm cell in between the plasterboard and the underside of the fireboard.
That's the cellulose, is that right?
Yes, recycled newspaper.
I'm learning. Just thinking about a couple of the items that I noticed, for example, the windows. I was quite surprised to see that you had wooden windows. Is that something very new on the market?
No, wooden windows have been on the market forever.
Okay, that was a silly. I walked into that one. Wooden Passivhaus certified windows or not?
No, there have been wooden Passivhaus certified windows as well. But what was different about these windows, and they were just certified at the Passivhaus conference this year, is that they don't have a foamed insulation in the middle. So they rely on the timber to achieve the thermal performance. And they're very deep, so that they're about just under 150 mil deep. And that works pretty well in the straw bale wall because the wall itself is so deep. Whereas, there could be situations in which that was not appropriate. But for this particular house, they were sort of spot on for us, really. And then you use wood fibre board overlapping the windows on the outside. So you've got a kind of insulated reveal that the window's sitting in.
Have there been any parts of the airtight barrier that you've had to reinforce in some way?
No, it's one thing that was really interesting was that because the timber frame went up and then the roof board went on and then the straw bale, we were working inside because it's really important that the straw bale is kept dry. Some of the joints you had to kind of imagine, this is going to be joining onto that, and it wasn't actually there. And some of the people working on site found that quite difficult. So there were some places where we had to, where the line wasn't in quite the right place and we had to adjust it. But that was, reasonably doable.
As you get towards the end of it, I'm sure you're very excited to move in, but have there been any learnings of this project, things that you would recommend to others who might like to go down this route?
Well, I think the airtightness is really interesting working with these kind of materials because you've got to be very, very precise. And on the whole, that's not quite the way people work on site in this country. And I can see that there's a sort of role for someone who's the very precise airtightness geek person, who's just got their eye on things and saying, oh, that's actually got to be just that much tighter here. And I think that, I'm kind of going to be interested to see how sort of Passivhaus, as Passivhaus moves more into the mainstream and people are doing it more and more, how that will develop within building firms, whether they'll tend to sort of have somebody who's really that person or whether that approach will be taken on by a kind of broader group of people. I mean, the other thing is fitting the windows, because that also needs to be very, very precise, because you can imagine, the windows don't open and close properly unless they're absolutely fixed. And also the thermal seal all around them needs to be spot on. And we were using this wide compression seal material, which I think is really good for fixing windows. So that's also another area where you've got to be very, very precise. So in a way, there are certain key moments where you've got to be absolutely spot on, and knowing where those are, planning for that, and making sure that there are the right people around at the time. I think that was really interesting for me to see that those are different moments.
Is it important for you to reach the Passivhaus standard, or is that just something that would be great to be able to certify it?
Yeah, I'd really like to certify it because it's a language that we all understand. Either you've achieved it or you haven't. If we don't achieve it, that's okay. We'll have got very near it. And the difference in the building performance between not quite achieving it and achieving it is really quite small. So I'm just really, it's just very exciting for me to have this house and this opportunity to live in it. So we'll just see how it goes.
In terms of costs, have there been any key areas that have been where the money's gone? That nice roof that you've got.
Yeah. The thatch was more, as I say, more expensive. Other things are quite sort of swings and roundabouts, I think. So the timber frame, which is beautiful primary frame, timber's not obviously as cheap as off the peg timber frame, but the people that we work with, the timber frame company, are very experienced and very economical and did a beautiful job. So I'm not sure that it necessarily would have been... Oh, obviously, you can do all these things cheaper. So what was great pleasure for me here on this job was to be able to work with people who I knew were going to do a really lovely job and to enjoy doing that together. And I think it's been reasonably economical given the lovely materials and so on that we've got.
Is there any way that we can make sure that we somehow get a project where we can have the best of everything, what are your tips for a self-builder who wants to build with quality but might somehow find things tough going?
Well, I think one thing is to look carefully at what people have done and trust to your judgment about people. So if you meet someone and you really think that they've done a really good job, and I mean, obviously there's a certain element of trust and you do make personal judgments about those people. But for work like this, I'm not in favour of, endless competitive tendering. And I mean, there are things where I've got a couple of prices for things, but on the whole, I think those kind of people who I really enjoy working with charge a reasonable rate for what they do, and I'm happy to pay them for it.
And finally, is there any aspect of this build that we haven't touched on that actually it's quite important that we do mention?
I think it's really important how it relates to the other buildings in the village. That's been really interesting. Loads of people in the village have come to see, and we had a big open day just as we completed the render on the outside. And people love it. And it's partly, I think, these materials that they can really connect to. And I would like to think also it's the way that I've designed it. And that it sits very on the site in relation to the other buildings and relates to them in a way that feels right.
I think it's a building that my wife would really like to see. So hopefully at some point I will be able to drag her to come and take a look. But thank you very much. Some great information today. Fran, really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We often talk about modern architecture on the podcast, so it's great to be able to feature something more traditional, those beautiful materials that Fran has got in her project. And as I mentioned, I was lucky enough to go and see it. So you can find out more about Fran and also the build, because she's been running her own blog, and I'll link across to that in the show notes. Today, they're at houseplanninghelp.com/42. You can also leave a comment there if there's something you want to pick up on. And I've got a question for you. Have you managed to incorporate natural materials on your project? Or if not, why not? And I'd like to hear what you have to say. Couple of things just before we conclude this episode. Google Plus Hangouts are back for this year, and I really want you to get involved. This is just a bit of fun. It's also a way of learning, and it doesn't really matter whether you're a construction professional or you're someone looking to build your own house. Perhaps you're just starting out on your research, but it's an opportunity for us to come together, share information and learn along the way, and also learn in terms of what we do differently in different countries. I'm really up for this. I've tried to involve more conversations across the water, whether we're going to the States or around the other side of the globe in New Zealand or wherever it might be. It's an opportunity to come together, and quite a mix of topics too. For example, let me just read a couple of them here. Why are more people not retrofitting their homes, or weatherizing if you're out in the States? I think you use a slightly different term there. So that's one that I really want to get to grips with. Should my house be off-grid? Another topic. How can I stick to my budget? And we've got lots of others too. So if you want to check out the full list of topics and just see if there's anything that you're particularly drawn to, then you can find that at houseplanninghelp.com/hangouts. And I'll also link to it on today's show notes in case you missed that. But houseplanninghelp.com/hangouts. Finally, iTunes reviews. We're always after an iTunes review, but I've decided to set myself a little challenge as well for the next few months, and that is that I want to reach 100 reviews by the time we get to episode 50. Currently we're on 25, which is awesome, but I would love to boost that right up, and you could help me with that if you haven't given us an iTunes review yet. It doesn't take too long to do, so we have a link in the show notes just showing you where you could do that. And the best bit is that all these reviews count towards building up the profile of the podcast, and then other people get an opportunity to find it and absorb all of this content that we're creating. So please leave a review. Looking ahead to next time, David and Penny Learmonth are my guests, and we'll be talking about their experience of building an energy efficient home at the end of their garden. Until then, take care.